If you're not clear on your branding, I feel like that can be a little easier to tweak and shift and kind of grow into, but the messaging is so important. It is so critical to know exactly what it is that you want to teach your audience, how you want to educate them, what you want to educate them about, and to be able to come up with content that way. Welcome to another episode of Listeners to Leads, where I'm helping podcasters launch and maintain a lead generating show. I'm your host, Alicia Galati, the CEO and head podcast strategist behind Galati Media, a full-service podcast management company. On this show, you'll hear my guests and I discuss everything it takes to launch a successful podcast and keep it running. If you're ready to get leads, land speaking gigs, and create deeper connections with your audience through your podcast, then this is the show for you. Today on the podcast, we're going to be talking about how to know if launching a podcast is going to be right for you. A lot of the time, I will talk to people who kind of have an idea of a podcast, or they're not really sure if a podcast is right for them and their business. So here we're going to talk through a few things to note and to kind of take the time to consider before you launch a show. So here are a few things that you're going to need to consider before you launch a podcast. The first thing you want to consider is, do you already have an established audience? Most people think that a podcast is a great way for them to grow an audience, and yes, it is, but I want you to also know that you're not going to see as much traction on your podcast if you don't already have an established audience. So if you're banking on your podcast creating this incredible group of people around you, yes, that can happen, but it's not going to happen for a while. Podcasting is a long game. So when you are trying to grow your audience and use your podcast to grow your audience, you're not going to see that traction and that growth immediately. So do you already have an established audience? Another thing to consider is, do you understand what that audience needs? So this goes back to being clear on your branding and your messaging and what it is that you want to do in the world. We typically do not work with business owners who are starting out. We typically don't start with business owners who are shifting their business. I tend to work with people who already have something of an established audience. I'm not saying you have to have 20,000 followers on Instagram or anything like that in order to have an established audience. Not what I mean. But you have to have people who are willing to listen. You have to have a clear direction on the kind of message that you want to put forth into the world and the kind of work that you do. And yes, my team can help kind of facilitate that and structure that in a way that makes the most sense for podcasting, but it's important that you know this. So something that I've been kind of ruminating on a lot lately is the fact that I get really, really excited about podcasts. I love them. I love the industry. I love podcasting. I love all of the things that go into a podcast. But if there's one thing I can't do for my clients, we can do so much for our clients. Literally, all they have to do is record and put it into a Google Drive. But the one thing I cannot do for them is the recording. I cannot record your message for you. So you have to be very clear. And no podcast manager, you don't have to work with us to know this, right? You have to be clear on your message. You have to be clear on what it is that you want to speak into the world in order to know, okay, a podcast is right for me. So that's the second thing to consider is, do you know what it is that your audience wants to learn about, what they want to hear from you, where do they want to kind of see that growth happen? And are you clear on your branding and your messaging? If you're not clear on your messaging, then that's obviously going to be a problem with coming up with content ideas or coming up with an actual episode, right? It's really just going to be random conversations. And sure, you can call your podcast random conversations with insert host name here. Like that is something that you can do, and that's fantastic, but know that that's not going to generate leads for your business. If you're not clear on your branding, I feel like that can be a little easier to tweak and shift and kind of grow into, but the messaging is so important. It is so critical to know exactly what it is that you want to teach your audience, how you want to educate them, what you want to educate them about, and to be able to come up with content that way. You might be thinking, well, Alicia, how in the world do I do that? 2 things. First, I am opening up strategy sessions. So if you would like to book a strategy session, you can go to my website to be able to book that. So that is a 1-hour one-on-one time with me. If you're like, hey, I just need to get in your ear and understand some things, we can work with you and we can help you and support you with that. We'll have the link to book that call in the show notes, but you can head to my website, aliciagalati.com, and you should be able to find something there. If not, links in the show notes. The other thing that you can do that will not cost you any money, but it will cost you time and effort and planning, is to check out episodes 22, 23, and 24. So 22 was all about the importance of podcast market research and how to do it. That is going to help you with your launch. It's going to be able to kind of guide you on the things that you need to look for when you're doing that market research. So that way you can ensure that you're kind of sticking within your industry and you become recognizable within your industry, but also finding ways to differentiate your content so that way you can still show up as you within the podcasting space. So yes, there are tons of podcasts out there, and we want to make sure that you are standing out as your awesome, unique individual self. Episode 23 is how to create a podcast launch plan. Now that is going to help you be able to plan out your launch over the course of 2 months, kind of step by step, the things that need to happen. Granted, we can take over this stuff and kind of talk through it during a session. If you're like, okay, I listened to the episodes, Alicia, and I still need help. Not a problem. We can help you. And then episode 24, which is how to plan out the first or next 10 episodes of your podcast. That is going to help you be able to determine what kind of content you need to create. Now, that kind of brings me into that third thing that you need to consider is, can you come up with 3 to 5 content buckets to use to kind of guide the conversations that you're having on your show? Whether that is the conversations you have with your audience or you have with a guest and you allow your audience in on that conversation. What are content buckets? Content buckets are, and I like to use this analogy because it makes sense in my brain. We have a splash pad that we like to take our kids to, and if you've ever been to a splash pad or some type of water park, you know that there's that big bucket that fills up with water and then it tips over and it fills up all these other buckets, or it spins those things and those spinny things that the water goes through. And that big bucket is all of your incredible ideas and all the things that you want to share with the world. And you have so many incredible things that you want to talk about and things that you want to share, but not all of them make sense for your podcast. So you need to use those smaller buckets as filters so that when you are talking to your audience and creating content for your podcast, you can kind of filter through the things that actually make sense for your show. So the content buckets for the Listeners to Leads podcasts are the following: podcast launch, which we're talking about now, right? This is the topic we're talking about. Podcast marketing, podcast content, and podcast monetization. The 5th one is one that I think is important, and we don't have a lot of specific episodes on it, but I like to tie it in to the conversations that we have here, and that is mindset. Because podcasting is showing up as yourself for your audience and really being able to be vulnerable sometimes, and that can create some mindset issues, especially when it comes to imposter syndrome. So mindset is something that I like to bring into the conversation when and where I feel it is important. But that's why I have that as one of those pillars, is because it's an important value to me to be able to share mindset tips, tricks, strategies. Like, obviously, I'm not a mindset coach. I don't want to be a mindset coach, but I know it's important to my audience. So podcast launch, podcast marketing, podcast content, podcast monetization, and mindset. Those are the 5 content buckets. If I create content that is outside of those, so the big brain water bucket, right? Like all these ideas, if that gets dumped down and something falls outside of those buckets, that does not belong on this podcast. I'm going to add that you will have conversations that add value and personality to a podcast as well. So you might have a side story that's important, like my side story about the splash pad. Obviously, a splash pad does not fall within those buckets, but it is relevant to the topic and the point that I'm trying to make. So it's okay to use those. Feel free to do what you want with your show in that regards of like, if you feel like a story is going to add value and inspiration to your audience, then go ahead, do it. The last thing that I want you to consider when you're thinking of, is launching a podcast right for you, is, do you have the capacity to do it? This is something that I think a lot of people get stuck on. And that is this idea that you have to push through and create content and go. And you just, I don't personally believe in that. Yes, I believe in consistency. Yes, I believe in creating consistent content for your audience so that they can be educated and know you and learn from you and buy from you. But I don't think that you should add something to your plate that is going to be detrimental to your mental health, your physical health, mental well-being, none of that. We don't want to add more things to your plate if you don't have the mental space or the time space to do it. So if you are DIYing your podcast, I want you to know that you need to know, do you want your podcast to be high quality? Do you want the audio editing to be high quality? That's going to take you time and effort. Do you want to hire that out? What does that look like? What does your budget look like? Those are all things that are going to help you decide, do you have the capacity to do it? If you listen to the last solo episode I did, which was how to choose a podcast format, you'll know that I talked about picking the day of the week and how it's important to be consistent with your podcast content. So if you know, hey, I'm not going to be able to be consistent with my show, then you need to know that right off the gate, like right away. You need to know if you're going to be able to show up in a podcast format every week or every other week or twice a week or whatever it is that you decide to do for your audience. You also need to know that if you want to grow your podcast and grow your podcast audience, you have to be able to put in time for promotion. And that could be graphics or pushing things on social media or whatever. So make sure that you're creating some space and you have that time, or you're hiring out and coming up with an actual plan to launch your show. So that is how you're going to know, do you have the capacity? Overall, this is obviously one of my shorter episodes, but it's really important to consider when you're trying to figure out if launching a podcast is right for you. Again, if you need support on any of this, you can always slide in my DMs or book a one-on-one call where we can go through some things. I'll give you some templates, be able to help you strategize and figure out if launching a podcast is going to be right for you. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Listeners to Leads. If you found something in this episode valuable, I would really appreciate it if you shared it with a friend who you know would also get value from it. Want to send me a message? My favorite place to hang out is Instagram. You can find me at alicia.galati. Let me know what your favorite takeaway was from the episode. And don't forget, turning those listeners into leads is actually easy.